Welcome everybody to the Distributed Solar for Home, Farm, and Business web seminar today. We're going to be talking about distributed solar, and I'm going to have a number of comments throughout this. And again, ask questions in the chat, and we'll have some time for verbal questions at the end. I've got a lot of topics that I'm going to try to cover today, but this is really an introduction to this topic, and some of the details can come as you ask me individual questions on the phone or on email later on. But we're going to try to get to a lot of the things that will help you understand these systems a little better. We're going to talk a little bit about solar motivations, a little bit about how solar works, some equipment design, some about production and orientation of these systems for best production. We're going to focus a lot on economics, and actually I reorganized this presentation a little bit to get economics up front. I'm going to also talk about picking an installer that will help you start going through that process, and then finally any questions you have. Really what it comes down to is economic return of these systems will vary quite widely on four things: rates. The rates you pay, the higher rate you pay, the better the economics, because you're avoiding higher cost electricity. The utility policy, whether that be a net metering policy, a net billing policy, or a buy all sell all policy. We're going to cover those in good detail today. Really important. The cost of the system, clearly, if the system costs less, it is going to have a better payback. Now, we want a good quality system, so we can't skimp too much, but we want to lower cost systems do better. And finally, incentives. We're going to cover all four of these. I bring this up. What I did on this is I varied just the utility policy to make a point a little bit. And I'm not trying to make a point about an argument about policy right now, because that's not what this is about. This is about doing economic analysis. But if we were looking at a residential system over here on the right, a 6 kW system that has a net metering policy, has a payback of 12.7 years in the location that I modeled, with the rate structure that I modeled for this one. If that is a net billing policy at 16.1 years, and if it's a buy all sell all policy, I'd be 50 plus years. So we have three different policies, all of which exist in Nebraska in different parts of the state. And so to say that a system has a payback of one particular year or another is really not accurate. It's going to be quite varied. And that's why we really need to understand what policy is going to be in place in your utility at the time you put that system in, so that you can make a good decision whether this is going to be what you want or not. In commercial, it's a little bit lower, but that's because of the ability to use depreciation as an incentive. In this case, net metering 10 years, net billing 12, and then 19 to 50. Again, I varied on a couple different buy all sell all policies that made that range a little different. These are with the federal tax credit, but not any other incentives like the REAP grant. We'll cover those as well. So kind of some range of what you see going on in the state right now. And I think that you'll get a better picture of what's going on when I move forward here. One of the things I want to really focus on quickly is just a definition, in this case, of distributed versus utility. In this case, distributed systems, which is what this workshop is about, are small scale systems that are grid connected, usually customer owned, and the energy is used by the customer first. Utility scale systems are great big systems, usually over multiple acres in size, owned by the utility or an investment company, are grid connected, and the electricity flows to the grid and is sold in mass to the grid and in wholesale. And so these are very, very different kind of animals when it comes to how do we calculate economics and things like that. And so I want to just make sure that we understand today we're talking about distributed systems. If you have a question about utility, we can talk about those, but there's just the economics, and a lot of the things are very different. And a lot of things that apply to distributed don't apply to utilities, and vice versa. So today we're going to be talking about distributed systems. What I mean by behind the meter is simply this: that the generation system, in this case we're talking about solar, is on the customer's side of the meter. So we can imagine that the electricity made by that system is used by the customer first, and then any excess may flow out to the grid. But it is behind the meter. Now, modern electric meters today can do a lot of things beyond just measuring electricity. They can measure the time of day it's used. They can measure a peak. They can measure power quality. They can measure in two directions. So when there's kind of some talk about net metering, where the solar array would make the meter flow backwards by spinning that little wheel backwards. Well, that is not a bad way to think about it, but in modern days, meters don't have that little wheel anymore. They're simply a little computer, and they'll simply measure in both directions. They'll measure what comes in and what goes out as two separate numbers, and those modern meters can do that and then bill accordingly. I installed a system in 2017. I'm just going to present a little bit on that. This is the crew I hired. I joke around that they were not real hard workers, but I did most of the work. Here's my system going in. It's facing due south. I'm looking north in this picture. This was in February of 2017. As it goes up, here's the little feet that the rails get attached to. There's the rails going in. There's the solar array itself. This solar array is approximately 24 feet wide by 13 feet in height. So that gives you a little sense of how big it is. And it runs 60% of my house on an annual basis. So just to give you a sense of size, it doesn't run my house on an instantaneous basis necessarily. It runs my house on a just 60% on an annual basis. I do have a string inverter. We're going to talk more about the different types of inverters and the pros and cons of those and the applicability for them. I do have a string inverter on a roof mount for any of you people that are well read on the electric code. This was installed under the 2014 electric code, and it did meet that code at that time. I would have to do it slightly differently under the current electric code. And so in this case, it's being installed. So we have the DC wires and the AC wires. I needed a disconnect. This is my disconnect going in. And then finally, the inverter fully installed and the meter fully installed. Have to have some final details, some of the placarding that's required. So this is some of the placarding that tells the operating attributes of the DC side and the AC side of the system. My production has been very close to what I expected, which is very good. And I wanted just to point out some interesting things happening on here. The red here at the bottom is when it was turned on, so it didn't produce much that month because I just turned it on at the end of the month. This one was the day I downloaded it. And then finally, you've got some things like, look at the variability in February caused by snow. When it snows, covers it up. I don't get up there and sweep it off, because anybody that has a roof mounted system should not get up there and sweep it off, because it's not safe to be on a roof in February. And so, or any other snowy month. So stay off the roof, but you're going to lose a little production because of snow, and you just have to accept that. And so I've had particularly 2 years that were not very good in snow, where it was both snowy and cold. But there are other months that are really quite very close. October is very, very similar every year. So that's kind of interesting to see. May, again, depends on how much rain we got in that May, how good that did. So kind of interesting. I will tell you that my 2022 was the best year I've ever had. And that is a good thing for my solar and a bad thing, because it didn't rain much and it didn't have very many cloudy days. As I went through the process, I recorded my process because I think it'll be similar to yours. And I want to point out a couple important things. The red are the parts that you're going to do. First, studying your electric bills and looking for places to have better efficiency in your home. That's always the place to start before doing solar is gaining that efficiency. Second, doing your solar homework. That's part of what you're doing today by viewing this webinar. Figure out why you want solar and write down your goals. That's going to be important because you're going to have better conversations with your installer if you write down why you want it. And we'll touch on that in the next slide as well. get quotes and talk to multiple installers, and then contact your utility. And you really need to contact your utility early in the process, just so that you're not surprised and they're not surprised. And also, you need to contact the utility before you sign a contract with installers. And part of the reason is that we talked about those policy differences at the beginning. And if there's a policy or something that causes a very long-term payback and it's maybe not as good economically, you need to know that really early before you've signed any contracts. So talk to the utility. They can also help you through the process at times. So you want to talk to them very early. Your installer is going to do basically 5 through 16. They're going to do the design and pull the building permit if it's needed. They're going to arrange for the electrical permit and arrange for the electrician if they need one, if it's not them. They're going to arrange for the electrical inspection, get all the labeling. And then finally, the utility agreement is signed by you, but sometimes facilitate, between you and the utility. You have to get that signed. The utility is going to put a new meter on, do a site inspection, then you're ready to go. Turn it on, let it run, let it produce electricity. And then you do want to monitor. This number 20 is really critically important. Monitoring is super important for multiple reasons. And I'm going to harp on it a couple different times today, but it's really important for a couple reasons. Number one, you want to be able to show off to everybody else how you're doing. So let's just demonstrate how I can show off. I can pull mine up and say, well, look, this is what it's producing right now. It's producing 1,700 watts right now. This is what it's done today. This is what it's done this month. And this is what it's done this year. Of course, it's just the start of the year. We could look at last year. The gray is the predicted values. And so we'll see if it comes up. If it doesn't quick, we'll let it go. But we want to be able to do that. And there's my production last year. And so it's really important to be able to show off. But beyond showing off, there are some inverters that require it being hooked to the internet to activate the warranty. Wow, monitoring is really, really important if it activates a warranty. And so in all cases, we should be monitoring those online if at all possible. And so that can be forgotten about. Some installers don't do that as well as others. So you want to get that monitoring hooked up. People want solar for different reasons. There was a time when somebody told me once, well, John, you need to tell people that this isn't a good economic investment. And I said, well, I'm not going to tell people that. Partially because how about I just help them do the economic analysis and then they can determine whether it's a good deal for them or not. Because people have different motivations. There are some people that are very green oriented and very green motivated. And if I tell them we do the calculation and it's a 15-year payback, and they might say, oh, well, that's not too bad. It should last 25 years. I'm pretty happy. Another person who might be I'm saying ongoing savings, we'll call that economic oriented, might say, well, I have other investments that are better than that, right? So there are different motivations out there, and we want to make sure that we recognize that what are those motivations. And I think this is where by writing down why you want this system and what are your goals for this system, that's going to be really important for your installer to be able to reach those goals. If you're very economically oriented, your installer needs to know that. If you're very green oriented, your installer needs to know that, because they may size the system slightly differently based on your different motivations. Tax credits are reasons people might want them. People might want them to show off to their neighbors. They want it attached to their home or business. Marketing, depreciation, again, a tax benefit. And marketing. If this is a business, let's say a farm that does a lot of on-farm sales, they might want to be known as green, and then having a solar array on the property where it can be seen by their clients could be a good thing for them. So again, there's value in that marketing. And that's where, by giving that some value, it might change the way you look at how much the system costs. We got to go back a little bit. Some cons. These systems are expensive initially, and it's definitely a hurdle to get over. They have operation and maintenance. Although the operation and maintenance is very small, it's it exists. I mean, we have to make sure that these things stay running. We might have to get them fixed if they break down. We may not be able to regain that investment if we move. So if you're a young person and you don't know if you're going to live in your house for very long, this may not be the investment to put on that home. If we know we're going to live at a place a long time, that's going to make it work better, because in selling the house with solar, it may or may not recoup the value of that solar. Community solar is an option. I'm not going to touch on this very much in this particular webinar, but community solar is where a larger solar array goes up in your community, and you can buy panels within that solar array with all kinds of different ways of them giving you value back for that. But it can provide an idea of green energy. You can participate without putting it on your home, which is good for people that have too much shade or an apartment or something like that. You can sell it back when you move. You don't have any operation and maintenance. You have very little risk. Some of the cons, you may not get the tax credit because many times they don't pass that through. You may not get depreciation because many times that can't be passed through, and is definitely not at your location for marketing purposes. So there are pros and cons to these. And then the economics, again, with community solar purchases vary quite a bit depending on how they write up those contracts. Let's touch about solar just a little bit. I'm not going to go through the details, but when we talk about an entire system, we're typically going to say the solar photovoltaic array. So I would say my solar array is the whole thing on my roof plus my inverter and everything, the array. An individual solar panel, the industry calls a module. I bring that up for two reasons. One, because if you're searching for solar panels online, the company that's selling them is going to sell modules. And so now you know the name of a solar panel, what the solar industry calls it. Also, because this impacts some of the federal import tariff rules, also a module has solar cells. So now that we have these two words and kind of these definitions up a little bit, the Obama administration and the Trump administration both put in place some import tariffs on imported solar modules and cells. And one of the things that the Trump administration did is then excluded a certain amount of cells from the import tariff so that they could import solar cells to a company in the United States that was going to make the modules from imported cells. So now we at least understand some of that language a little bit when it comes to those import tariffs. Inside those the solar panels or the solar cells is silicon. That's the main component, and almost all of them are made from silicon. And I think I have a slide coming up to talk a little bit more about some other chemistry. Let's jump into economics, because this is really the heart of the presentation. We're going to talk about costs, incentives, and then ongoing savings, the value of the electricity that is generated by the solar array. So when we think about this process, we start with a gross cost, the total cost of the system. We subtract out some of the incentives like the tax credit, the depreciation, any other local incentives, the renewable energy credits, which probably you're not going to get if you're in Nebraska because we don't have any access to them, to selling those, the balance of the investment or the net cost of the system, and then finally the ongoing savings. What's important about this is that it's really important to understand the gross cost. What am I writing the check for? We a lot of times do the economics based on the net cost because we know that we're going to get those incentives. But if we were just to report the net cost, you can imagine having an installer say, well, the net cost of the system is $15,000. And then they say, oh, please write us a check for $25,000. Well, that seems a little weird. It seems a little odd. So it's really important to understand that we write the check for $25,000. We get some of these incentives after the fact, and then we have this net cost that from our economic analysis that we have to eat away at with ongoing savings. Let's talk about gross costs a little bit. This slide is just a little bit old, and 2018 was when it was made, but it's pretty accurate at the moment. And I didn't have anything better to update it with, so I think I have some details in here. But we can see two things here. Number one, the cost of systems have declined dramatically in the last 10 years. Residential and commercial tends to be, basically a larger bit, a business system that's usually on the high end of maybe net meters, so 25 kW or larger. That tends to be some of the commercial systems. The range that I'm seeing in Nebraska today tends to be somewhere maybe from about $2.50 to about $3 and maybe 25 cents. That is per watt. So if I think about a system that is 10 kW or kilowatt, that's 10,000 watts. So that system would cost somewhere between $25,000 and $32,000 in that range. Now, that is pretty wide range, but what I am seeing is that ground-mounted systems with string inverters tend to be on the lower side. Roof-mounted with microinverters tend to be on the higher side. Little smaller systems tend to be on the higher side. Little larger systems tend to be on the bottom side. That's kind of the range I'm seeing. Now, if you went and got a quote and it was just above that range, I mean, inflation might have got us a little bit, and it could be a little above that. I did talk to a farmer from another state recently that had a couple quotes that were a little above that. But that's generally the range that we're seeing. And again, this is, we take the total DC rating of the system in watts, divide the total price by the number of watts, and we get a price. So again, if we had we got a quote for 25, let's say $20,000, and it was a 6 kW system, I would say $20,000 divided by 6,000, and that's $3.30 a watt. And the nice thing about doing these little bits of math when we get multiple quotes is then we can compare two systems because we have them in the same units, dollars per watt. And so we can kind of get a good sense of the difference between the two systems. Let's talk about the tax credit incentive. The tax credit incentive was on a decline at the start of 2022, but since in the mid 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed by Congress, and that reinstated the investment tax credit to 30% for 10 years through 2032. And so the investment tax credit means I invest, I spend money on solar equipment, I get 30% of that back as a tax credit. For commercial systems, that's 1 megawatt, or think about that as 7 acres of solar or bigger. They can use either the investment tax credit or a production tax credit. But for these small systems we're talking about today, we're only going to talk about the investment tax credit because we're not talking about those bigger systems. The way that's going to work is we simply do a form on our IRS, on our taxes, and that form simply asks, how much did you spend on solar this year? You say $10,000. They say multiply that times 0.3, $3,000, subtract that off from your tax burden. And so in this case, it is almost everybody's going to get it. And I say almost because remember, this is a tax credit. And so those that aren't paying taxes, there's some different things going on. I'll present in just a moment, but you don't get it right away. So if you install that system in June, you're not going to get this tax credit until you do your taxes the next year. So you got to remember that you still have to write that check for the full amount, get that tax credit the next tax year. I do want to just point this out. Now I got to kind of switch hats to utility scale. For larger scale systems, remember this 1 megawatt or above, there are some rules that they can get some additional tax credits if they use domestically made materials. And I wanted to point that out only because I'm hoping that this will drive some more companies in the United States to build the solar panels in the United States. And so we have seen a couple companies announce expansions or building of factories. And I think this is why. And so that's going to be interesting to see in the future. We'll have a greater availability of American-made solar panels. Currently, there are some companies that make solar panels in the United States, but 80% of the industry is in China currently. Now, this is again for larger scale systems, but I think it's important for kind of people to understand as they have discussions that starting in 2025, the federal government is kind of changing up the whole green energy tax credit system. And what they're doing is instead of saying we're picking a winner that wind gets a tax credit and solar gets a tax credit, they're simply going to follow what the overarching idea that they really want, which is to reduce carbon emissions. And they're going to say that any electricity source that does not emit carbon dioxide can get the production tax credit or the investment tax credit. And so we could imagine if carbon capture became a thing and it became economical, a natural gas power plant that sequestered its carbon underground could get a tax credit because they did not emit carbon dioxide. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, but it's basically taking a technology neutral approach and saying, let's let the market become competitive and see who can generate electricity that doesn't emit carbon dioxide. And of course, wind and solar already don't, so they qualify very easily. They still, I think in the near term, they're still going to be the most using of this tax credit. Some other things happening, and this is a slide just kind of, again, talking about some of the other things happening in the Inflation Reduction Act, but the one I wanted to point out was this bottom one here, this direct pay option. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, you had to be a taxpayer to get a tax credit. That seems pretty obvious, but they're creating a direct pay option so that tax exempt entities can get a payment in lieu of the tax credit equal to the allowable tax credit. And I think that that's going to be interesting for Nebraska really in a couple of ways, but the most important way may be that we now may see some of our public utilities opting to own and operate a system, a solar or wind system, rather than buying the electricity from a private developer. Right now, before this, we've seen almost all off buying from private development because the private developer could get the tax credit. We now may see some public utilities interested in owning and operating their own. The other thing that could be interesting is this idea of nonprofits. I know that there's been some interest in churches putting in solar to reduce their monthly cost for electricity and also to be green. And the economics before weren't great because they weren't able to access the tax credit. But now that they could access this direct pay option, the economics might get better. And I can see that as an option for some churches or other nonprofits to be able to put in solar more economically. So lastly, the Inflation Reduction Act funded more heavily the Rural Energy for America program under the USDA Rural Development. And by giving more money to that, there's more money for energy efficiency and renewable energy projects for farmers. And then also they upped the cost share of that from 25% to a maximum of 50%. Now I have a little update here. Since I wrote this slide, the USDA came out with their Rural Energy for Program grant maximum, and they designated it as 40%. So again, that went from 25% to 40%. And so that's going to be a big deal if a business can get that. The last thing I want to point out, this doesn't have anything to do with solar, but I think it could be interesting for those of you on the listening to this web seminar, is that the Inflation Reduction Act put in some tax credits for energy efficiency home improvements, like energy audits, exterior doors, exterior windows, air conditioning improvements, electric panel upgrades, qualified furnace equipment, heat pumps, etc. Now, it is a maximum of $1,200 a year. So essentially, you spent $4,000, and you got a $1,200 credit. If you spent $8,000, you still get a $1,200 credit. So there's a maximum annually, but definitely if you're doing any energy efficiency, think about claiming that tax credit and getting some value there. I'm going to take a break just for a second and look at the questions. I see there's a question on the chat. The question is about the first question is about solar heat and hot water. Yes, solar heat and hot water are still a thing, but in many cases, the economic return hasn't been very good. And so in some ways, what I've seen with solar heat particularly is that people from that installed systems in the 70s, or people that bought houses with systems on them from the 70s, they're having to either remove those or revamp them and fix them up. And so there is some of that happening where they're fixing some of those systems. But the reality is, when we look at the cost of some of the heating that we do today and the high efficiency heating, in many cases, those solar hot air systems have been very expensive, and the economics haven't been very good. And that's why we really haven't seen very many. Solar hot water is kind of the same way. Solar hot water makes the most sense when you have a high hot water use, where you have a hot water use that's more consistent during the day. If the trouble is for a kind of a single family home is we use hot water in the morning and then maybe a little bit when we're washing at night or something, but we really don't have a consistent enough use to really take full advantage of all the solar heat that's gained. And so a lot of times those systems end up heating up to their maximum by midday, and then they don't do anything the rest of the day because we're not using the heat, using the hot water system. So thanks for your question. Feel free to ask more detail if I didn't answer quite what you're looking for. On the first slide, I said NPV, net present value, is another question that came up. And so the net present value is, if I'm assuming this system is going to last 25 years, which the solar panels are warranted for production for 25 years. So that's why we assume they'll last 25 years, even though they could last longer. The net present value would be, what is the value of that system 25 years from now in today's dollars? And it's a way of looking at the system as an investment. And if the net present value is above 0, it is considered a good investment. Now, net present value is based on a discount rate that is a very individual number for an individual investor. And so those NPVs on the front page are based on a 5.5% discount rate, which may or may not be what you would want to designate your discount rate. Net present value is a very robust economic metric, but tends to be used most when a business has two different investments that they're trying to compare. A residential person using net present value, it's a little bit less, it's a little harder to interpret, but a way to think about it is that if I had investments, let's say in the markets, in the stock market, and I was hoping and expecting maybe I could get a 6% gain per year, I might put my discount rate at 6% and say, will this solar array gain 6% in that 25-year period or not? And so having that 6% discount rate would tell me whether that system gains 6% or not. But again, if it doesn't and it gained 4%, then you have to decide, okay, is it still a good investment for me or not? My net present value is negative, but only because it didn't gain 6%, it gained 4%. So that's what the NPV is. And we can talk about it a touch more later, but that's more for more detailed analysis presentation that I have. Let's talk about depreciation a little bit as we move forward. Depreciation For those of you who have businesses, understand that it's a tax advantage to be able to depreciate the personal property. There is a accelerated depreciation or a bonus depreciation in effect through 2027, where I can depreciate much faster. The 100% bonus where I can depreciate it all in year one just expired, but 80% is in place this year and so on. But you can always go to even when this is done after 27, depreciation will still happen just under the old MACRS, the Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System plan of 5-year depreciation. But it is an important tax advantage for businesses that really can help these systems look good. All right, let's talk briefly about other incentives. And I'm not sure, I have a couple of slides, but not too many. There's not a lot of other incentives available to us here in Nebraska. If you're a Lincoln Electric Systems customer, there is what they're calling a capacity payment that you can qualify for. That is an additional incentive. Those incentives may come, there's some other utility-based incentives may come up in the future. So that's where it's important to ask your utility. I wouldn't expect that there is one in most places, but you could ask and see. LES, there's one now. There may be some others in Nebraska moving forward. The USDA REAP grant is a large one that's available to rural businesses and farms. And it's not guaranteed, but it is available. So we could take that off if you are able to get it. Let's just talk about this REAP grant for a moment. It's available to farms and rural businesses. And it is important to note what rural means in this case. What rural means in this case is outside of a city of 50,000. So most of Nebraska is rural. So this could be a business in the middle of Norfolk, and it still is considered rural because it's outside of a city larger than 50,000. Or it's not in a city of 50,000 or more. The grants are up to 40%. It is a reimbursement grant, so you cannot spend anything ahead of time. If you bought the system, bought all the parts, then you applied for the grant and got the grant accepted, none of your costs count because you bought them before you apply. If you want this grant to count, you need to get the application completed before you spend any money. And then if you need to get this grant in order to build the system, you want to wait till you get approval or not approval, because it's going to be a competitive grant process. This is taxable income. Just want to make you aware of that when you get that grant, it is taxable. And so you don't get, truly 40% because you have that extra reduction in taxes. They also have loan guarantees. And again, remember, this is a competitive grant, not a guaranteed money. But if you do a good grant application, because they funded it at a higher level, there should be some people that are able to get this. Now we've subtracted everything off, remember, and we've got to our net system cost. Now we're going to talk about ongoing savings or the value of the electricity. So first, let's talk about how we're charged for electricity in our monthly bills. Every single bill is going to have some type of a customer or fixed charge. Now, it may not say it on the bill. My bill doesn't say I have a fixed charge, but I have one. That's where it's important to look at your rate schedule, not just your bill, when you're trying to figure out how you're charged for electricity. These customer fixed charges for residential tend to be between maybe $5 and $30, but they can be higher. Everybody has an energy charge, which is what they're charged per kilowatt hour. Demand charges are becoming more common. You're being charged for that peak moment in time in a billing period. That's becoming more common, but isn't in everybody's charge. Transmission and distribution charges may be spelled out as separate charges, either per kW in the case like a demand charge or per kilowatt hour. But most of the time in Nebraska, we're going to put these in with the energy charge, and so we don't actually see them spelled out. And finally, I call it other charges and fees, kind of cost recovery charges, taxes, other riders that are on the bill kind of come into play. But when we understand how this all happens, we can understand that when we generate solar, really the only electricity or only costs we can offset are these energy charges. We're still getting charged, our customer charged the same. We may have the same demand charge if we have it, because it's hard to avoid a demand charge, because the demand could be set on a day when it's cloudy or something like that. And so it's important to understand how we're charged for electricity. Now, how we're charged for electricity is changing quite rapidly, and that is going to influence the solar charges or solar economics quite a bit. We're seeing more and more time of use rates, which I have a slide on that coming up. We're seeing more and more demand rates, both at residential and commercial scale. We're seeing an increase in the customer charge, and usually that comes with a reduction in the energy charge, the per kilowatt hour. So what they're doing is they're moving some of their costs away from how much you use and towards that base fee. And some of that has to do with efficiency. The more people are efficient, the less they were spending on electricity, and the utilities needed to make enough money to become have consistent income to maintain the system. So there's some movement in that direction. Also, power factor charges, which is kind of, I'm going to call it electric quality. That's not quite correct electrically, but we're seeing some of those charges happen as well, particularly for irrigation customers in Nebraska. Time of use. So here's just a fun slide to think about. Here's two different rate schedules. Both are in Nebraska. And right now, this utility, you can choose between them, but they're very different. One, this is the summer months, June, July, August, September. And then the winter months are the rest of the year. And then the time of day on the top. Electricity in the summer is 8 to 10 cents. I'm rounding, but 8 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And in the winter is 6.7 cents all winter long. In a time of use rate, it can get as high as 20 cents per kilowatt hour in the afternoon in the summer, and as low as 4.7 cents in the wintertime in the overnight. I'm going to say this time of use rate schedule appears to be very scary. And I bring this up because, we're going to see more and more of this, and I want people to kind of be ready for it. It appears scary, but when I actually ran the numbers, when I modeled this across a small house and a large house, and this had the same load for both rate schedules, it came out that the small house, it didn't matter which rate schedule you were on, about the same price per year. The large house, a little bit of difference, but very similar. So again, not much different. But I think what's important is that when it comes to your ability to save on electricity, all you can do on the left-hand side here is use less electricity. It's really all you can do to save. I got to use less. On the right over here, we can actually just change our behavior a little bit using the same amount of electricity and still save. For example, what if I turn my my dishwasher on, at 7:30 instead of 5:30? Big difference. I pay half the electricity price at 7:30 as I do at 5:30. So just some simple behavior changes. Programmable thermostats are super powerful in this time of use rate schedule, because I can program them to avoid running at the highest times if possible. So again, when those time of use rate schedules come out, I don't think we should be scared of them if they're well designed. And but we need to be able to react to that and change, do some simple things. We can save some dollars. But hopefully, and that's what I'm demonstrating down here, if we don't change, we're not going to be punished very much, hopefully, if at all, if they're well-designed rates. Now, we can also imagine if the solar produces, we can offset 8 to 10 cent electricity, or if solar is producing here, we might be able to offset as high as 15 or 20 cent electricity. Now, there is a little bit of a an important detail here, that currently this rate schedule in the one utility in Nebraska that has it, they won't allow the net metering rider to be combined with that. But who knows what might change in the future. Keep an eye on your electric rate schedules. I just wanted to point out a federal law that is the Public Utility Regulatory Act of 1978, which allows everyone to attach a qualified facility to the utility grid and get paid for the excess at an avoided cost rate, and which is, you could think of like wholesale. In Nebraska, that avoided cost rate is 2 to 8 cents, and retail is 8 to 12 cents. So we're going to get into what that means, that excess, and what that means in a moment. But there is a federal law that kind of we can utilize if our state statutes aren't as clear. Okay, in Nebraska, we do have a net metering law, and net metering is a policy between the utility and the customer who generates that on-site electricity. And under net metering, a system owner receives at least a portion of their electricity, or receives retail credit for at least a portion of electricity they generate. In some cases, all of the electricity they generate, depending on some details. But net metering is an economic advantage to the customer if you can access that policy. And we'll understand why when I give some drawings here in a little bit. There's an important piece in that statute. It is that utilities must net meter customers. I'm paraphrasing the law here, but utilities must net meter customers until the net metered customer generation reaches 1% of the utility's demand, after which they do not have to net meter additional customers. This piece of in the statute is why there's a difference between the policies in Nebraska, because if the utility hasn't met the 1%, then those customers are net meter if their system meets the requirements. If there are now about 6 utilities that have reached that 1%, you want to know if yours has before you put this in, and then you have to figure out what policy have they adopted, and likely it's one of the 2 that I'm going to lay out, either net billing or the buy all sell all. All right, let's get some definitions really quick here. This is a really basic drawing of a grid connected solar electric system, where I have a solar array here to the left of any size, essentially. I have an inverter to turn that solar DC electricity in phase AC, and we're going to talk about inverters more later as we look at some of our design criteria. A disconnect, a meter, and a load. And there's 3 directions the electricity can go. This one here at the bottom, some of that solar electricity is used immediately by the load. If the solar is not generating enough, some electricity comes from the grid over to here to the right. And then finally, if there is overgeneration, then this goes out to the grid and is used by the neighbors. That is called excess generation. And I brought this, particularly this term excess generation, is an important definition to understand that what goes out on the grid is called excess generation. Because then when I subtract grid electricity here at the bottom, I minus that excess generation, then I get net excess generation. That is the term that our net metering law uses to define what is net metering. And again, net metering, the net is this subtraction between grid electricity and excess generation. The net of those 2, net excess generation. Not all systems will have net excess generation. If the grid electricity in that billing period is larger than excess generation, I don't have any net excess. But in some months you might. And so it's an important term to understand what is its value if I have any net excess generation. So back to the statute for a moment. I pulled out 2 of the places where net excess generation is both defined and then used. Net excess generation means the net amount of energy, if any, by which the output of a qualified facility exceeds a customer generator's total electricity requirements during a billing period. Again, they're talking about that subtraction between grid used electricity and excess generation. And it compensates the customer generator for net excess generation during the billing period at a rate equal to the local distribution utility's avoided cost of the electrical supply over the billing period. So again, if you have net excess generation, they'll buy that at avoided cost. But in the case, and we'll touch on this again in a minute, but in the case that grid electricity is larger than excess generation, all of that excess generation offset grid electricity. Thus, it had retail rate, retail value in a net metering situation. So now we have at least some understanding of both the flows of electricity, some definitions, and we'll touch on those more as we go forward. So let's think about a scenario here. We have a house connected to the grid, and we turn a light on it's nighttime. The grid electricity flows to the load. We're paying retail rate for that. The sun comes out, the electricity is flowing from the solar to the load. That is offsetting what we are buying from the grid. That's also worth retail because it's offsetting what we're buying from the grid. Finally, we go to work or something, turn off our load, the electricity flows out to the grid. Then that is excess generation. And now we have to really determine, are we on net metering? Are we on net billing? Are we on buy all, sell all, to figure out its value? So in this case, we have those three loads. I mean, I'm reiterating what we already covered. I have the grid electricity. I have the solar generation, which we're going to call we're going to call excess generation. And then we have the net excess generation. In the case that is a positive value, that means that we had more grid use than we had solar generation or excess generation, and we just pay for that net. And all in the case of net metering, all that excess generation had retail rate. In the case that's negative, then that represents net excess generation and gets paid out to us at avoided cost in the case of net metering. All right, let's review the three of these. I touched on net metering a couple times on the last two slides, but this is, I tend to designate these A, B, and C. Again, A, grid, B, excess generation, C, solar generated, used instantaneously. My electric bill, if I'm net metered, is going to simply say, I pay the dollars per kilowatt hour times A minus B. And in the case that A minus B is negative, then avoided cost rate is paid to the customer for that excess generation. And so this is quite a good thing for economic purposes for the customer generator, because then B has the greatest value possible in most cases. Now, my system very, very rarely has net excess generation because it's sized so that I just barely, I've had net excess generation a couple of months in the spring and in the fall, but no other month. And so a system that's about 50 to 60% of a load. So if a house uses 10,000 kilowatt hours and I design it for the solar to generate 5,000 to 6,000, that system is going to have very little net excess generation. But if I design a system that's closer to 100%, it's going to have quite a bit of net excess generation, especially during the spring and the fall months. And so that's, again, where design can impact the value of the electricity. Let's touch on the next one, net billing. So let's just imagine a scenario where your local utility reached their 1% of net metered customers, and they simply said, we're not going to net meter anymore. We're going to do net billing. Now, here's a challenging thing. There is no net in net billing, but they still call it net billing. But in this case, I'm simply going to pay for all of the grid electricity at retail cost. So I take A times my retail cost. I'm just going to pay for it all. And then in this case, I'm going to take all of B and I'm going to get a credit for that at avoided cost, which is usually less than retail, remember? And so that is essentially net billing. I sell all of, or I buy all of A, I sell all of B, excess generation, but C still gets used instantaneously and avoids A, right? And so it still has, C has retail rate because I avoided buying A. And that is net billing. Buy all, sell all is a little bit of a different situation. In this case, again, I'm going to buy all of A at retail. I'm going to sell all of B at avoided. But in a buy all, sell all, they're going to add a second meter. And they're going to add a second meter that's on the, in this case, the customer side of the meter. Actually, think about the meter being here in most cases. I just have it drawn right there, but so it's on the customer side of the meter, and that is measuring all the electricity that's coming out of the solar. And so in this case, they're going to take that solar meter and subtract B. So it's the solar meter total minus the B total, which gives me C. Then they're going to buy that C, even though it never went out to the grid, it just got used instantaneously in the home. They're going to buy that C at avoided cost. And then they're going to, let's go back, then they're going to sell it back to the customer at retail cost. And so that's what the buy all, sell all is. Now, let's rethink this just a little bit. So another way to think about buy all, sell all is that I'm just selling all of the solar to the grid and I'm buying all the electricity from the grid. That's a way to think about it, but I don't think it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that's what's happening, because it's not. What's actually happening is this solar meter where we're going to calculate this C that got used instantaneously, and again, buy that from the customer at avoided and then sell it back to them at retail, even though that electricity never left the premises. So kind of interesting what's going on. You can also recognize that all of the solar electricity then is worth avoided cost. And thus the economics, from an economic return standpoint, buy all, sell all tends to have the lowest economic return. Let's touch on some of trying to do a good financial analysis. We need to have a good estimate of the solar generation, and I'm going to touch on that in some slides here as we go forward. I'm just doing the economics first. We need a good estimation of the solar generation, including degradation of the solar panels and shading losses, if there is any. We need to know what the policy is, so we know how to value that net excess generation or any of the generation. We need to know what the inflation factor is. Electricity, and just like anything else, gets more expensive over time, and we need to have a good inflation factor built in. And I say good, meaning realistic. One of the easiest ways I've seen poor quotes from installers try to lie to a customer is simply put a very high inflation rate in. Well, didn't you know that electricity is going to inflate at 10% per year? Well, history hasn't proven that out. I know we're going to have a rough time here in this year and the next year maybe, but I struggle to think that we're going to inflate a whole lot faster than the economy. And so as the economy calms back down, eventually, the inflation will too. So we got to be careful and have a decent inflation factor. Again, having a discount rate that represents the customer if we're trying to calculate net present value. Doing the tax incentives properly, which usually isn't too hard, and utilities or installers have typically done a good job with that. Do we include insurance? Because there may be some additional insurance that you have to pay. We include that, and we have to include O&M. Now, should a not all installers are going to do a financial analysis. Some may not. And I don't think it's bad that they don't. But what I think is bad if they do a bad one. So if they do one, they ought to do a good one or do as good a job as they can. When we include all these things, we're going to come out with some metrics. Payback is probably the most common. It really is intuitive. I spent $10,000. How long does my system have to run to regain that $10,000? It's payback, simple payback. It's not the best one if we're really trying to get into comparing multiple investments, but it is very powerful in the sense that it's simple and it can be calculated pretty easily. Net present value, again, is a much better metric for when we're trying to compare cost. Levelized cost of electricity is essentially how much it's costing to make each kilowatt hour. It's not a great metric when it comes to comparing systems, but it can be interesting to see how much it costs per kilowatt hour that we generate. We could compare that to what we pay, but we should be careful in comparing it because our solar is not our sole source of electricity on most grid systems. It's not like we can just go off grid for that price a lot of times. And then looking at what will be our electric bill with and without the system. In Nebraska, I'm going to say this is true for 2022 as well. These numbers are pretty close. And then maybe the start of 23 is where we are now. When we use conservative assumptions, residential systems tend to come in 12 to 16 years payback. I've not seen very many that are below that. I've seen a few that are a little above it, but that's a pretty good range for what I've been calculating the last couple of years. Commercial or agricultural systems, 9 to 14 years, again, lower because of depreciation. I've seen even some ones below 9 now that have gotten the REAP grant. So that Rural Energy for America program grant can get that down even further. So again, that's kind of the range that we're seeing, and figuring out which is yours is going to be more unique. It can also, these are for net metered customers. Again, I think this is really important. This is for net metered customers. As we move to net billing and buy all, sell all, those numbers are much higher. All right. I don't see any more questions on the chat, so we'll keep moving on and touch on some equipment and design considerations. When we think about a system, there's a lot more to it than just the solar panels, the solar modules, and the racking. We've got wiring and combiner boxes and wire covers and trenching and inverters, disconnects, meters, placards, grounding. We need to understand, it's important just to think about that there's a lot more to it than just the simple pieces. And so if we were to go out and price modules, inverters, and racking, yeah, we got most of our major costs, but there's a lot more little pieces. But also, even these major costs are really only about 30% of the cost of a system. A majority of the cost of installation is in the labor to have that installation done. So that is just important to understand that the parts are a minority of the cost of a system. If you're really interested in trying to pick which solar panel that you might get, you can look some up online. Maybe it'd be better to talk to an installer and see what they can get because the availability has changed quite a bit. But silicon solar is the most common in the market today. And there's 3 types of silicon solar, 2 of which we're going to see the most. There's monocrystalline silicon, polycrystalline silicon, and then thin film. This mono and poly are clearly the best because they have higher efficiency and last longer. And these tend to be what dominates the industry. Now, I know what some people have told me. They'll say, well, I want monocrystalline because it's the most efficient. And I say, well, yes, except it's more costly. And so sometimes we want to balance that. And if, for example, if I'm putting these on a ground mount, and I could say, well, I could put up monocrystalline, I could put up 24 solar panels, or I could just put up 28 solar panels of the polycrystalline, and maybe it costs less, right? So sometimes if space isn't really limited, that polycrystalline can be a good deal, and actually has decent. And actually, these efficiencies are a couple years old. They're up a couple 2 or 3% on both of them from a few years ago. But they both have lifespans of 25 to 30 years, and that polycrystalline sometimes can be lower cost. And so I do see a lot of polycrystalline going in. I'm seeing a few monocrystalline going in as well. You want monocrystalline if you are space limited. If you have a small roof that is space limited, that's the time when monocrystalline panels tend to kind of shine. Some other chemistries that you may hear about: cadmium telluride, amorphous silicon, copper indium gallium selenide. Particularly the cadmium telluride are probably the second most common chemistry on the market. There's more and more of those out there, but the industry is still dominated by silicon. Again, I don't think that the chemistries make a big difference. Look at the price per watt. That's what you want to know. And you want to have lowest price per watt in most cases. When we think about the kind of how these are set up, I want you to note that this is the most common grid tied system, and we already kind of drew on a slide like this earlier. But what you want to notice here is there is no batteries. Most grid tied systems do not have a battery. So in the case of a power outage, let's say I have a power outage, this inverter recognizes that there's a power outage and goes into open mode and shuts off. Thus, you do not have any backup during a power outage. You have a big solar array that is trying to generate if it's sunny out, but the inverter is saying, I don't see the grid, and when it doesn't see the grid, nothing is going to happen. So you do not have backup power if you do not have batteries. I tend to not like batteries, and I tend to not like batteries mainly because they are very high cost. And what are they providing me? They tend to provide me with backup, really backup to a very robust grid. So I think you really have to think about only some people are going to have that need for backup high enough to justify the cost. Most people don't have a high enough need for backup. And if you do have a need for backup, I think there are other ways you want to consider. You may want to consider solar with batteries, but also consider a gas generator or something like that, and just see if which one is the most economical for your backup type of situation. If you are interested in batteries, there are two types of battery systems. There is AC coupled, and this is what I have drawn here. I have AC coupled grid tied solar. And so what we have is the existing solar PV inverters that we put in, and then we attach a second battery inverter to the battery bank. And so then this battery inverter can charge the batteries from the solar or from the grid if we tell it to. I mean, there's different ways you can program it, but it can charge that battery. And then in the case of an outage, we can island the system from the grid completely, and thus we can run some backup loads with that backup electricity for as long as the battery. This is all about the battery size, right? How long I can run my loads. If I want to run for a long time, I have to have a big battery. I only want a day or two, my battery could be more economically sized. But this is an AC coupled system. This tends to be what happens when you kind of add batteries after the fact. You put in PV, you had it for a few years, then you decide you wanted to add batteries. This tends to be what happens. If you come in before and decide you want a battery, it might be a DC coupled system. In this case, the battery can be charged by the DC, and it's on the DC side of the circuit. So I'm charging the battery with a charge controller. The battery then can go through the inverter, or I suppose maybe theoretically backwards as well, and get charged from the grid. And then that inverter can, the same as the other, it can run my loads. It can go onto the grid if I have excess, however I program it to discharge. And again, in the event of a power outage, I could disconnect and run off of that system. The AC, the solar can go through the inverter and go straight through, or the solar can go through the, depending on kind of how things are happening. Okay, let's talk about some different systems a little bit. There are essentially two types of systems. There is ground-mounted systems and there's roof-mounted systems. Ground-mounted systems tend to be put on some kind of a racking structure. And most of the time, ground-mounted systems tend to have large single inverters. In this case, it's called a string inverter because we have a string of solar panels. Actually, this is the way this one works. The string goes all the way down, comes back, and then goes into the inverter. And then there's a second string on the bottom. So this is one large solar array with one large inverter, a string inverter. String inverters tend to be the lowest cost, but because of the electric code, they tend to be mostly installed on ground mount systems. They also have some other advantages and disadvantages as well, but they are the lowest cost and work really well for ground mounted systems. If you're doing a ground mount, you really probably should be thinking about a string inverter. If you have a roof mount, you are going to probably be thinking about microinverters, which are one single small inverter that lives under each solar panel. And it's turning that DC electricity from the solar panel into AC right at the solar panel level. And so there's one under each one. And then those are connected together, and then they go into the roof underground under this solar panel here and get connected to the system. Microinverters are the most expensive, but they tend to be really good. They're easy to install, and they tend to be really good for roof-mounted applications. So in general, microinverters work with roof mounts. String inverters work with ground mounts. There is a hybrid system called a string inverter with optimizers that you can almost imagine is a combination of the two. It looks like a combination of the two. It acts more like a string inverter with a DC device that acts like a microinverter a little bit, but not actually inverting to AC. It can work for either one. So we do see some applications with that. Now, with added aftermarket equipment, we can put a string inverter on a roof mount. We're not seeing it very often because we have to have aftermarket equipment. And because of that, because of the added cost, we tend to not see microinverters with ground mounts. And that's why I draw the squiggly lines to just show that we don't see that very often. So back to what's normal. What's normal is microinverters with roof mounts, string inverters with ground mounts, and optimizers with either one. We are seeing some installers use these optimizers because they like that brand. So we'll show you those a little bit as well. When you're thinking about your system, you want to think about how big is it going to be? Well, how big is it going to be is depending on a couple things. First of all, are you space limited? You have a small roof, a small yard, are there trees and you're trying to avoid shade? If you're space limited, that may just limit your size. Well, my system is 4.4 kW because that's what fit on the roof I wanted to build, or that structure I wanted to build. I didn't want to build that structure larger, so it was limited to 4.4 kW. I could have maybe found a more powerful solar panel to get it a little bit higher, but I didn't, or I used the one I did. Electric use is a way to decide size. You could say, well, I want to produce a certain percentage of my load. If you have very green motivations, you may want to think about 100% of your load on an annual basis. If you're thinking economically, you may be more like 50% of your load on an annual basis. In which case, then you can design a system to be sized accordingly. People want to say, well, how much does a system cost? Well, how big is it? Is it 5 kW or is it 10 kW? Now, we're very different in prices. And then finally, initial cost. How much are you ready to spend when this decision comes? The system could be as big as your budget. You could plan for expansion if you'd like in the future, or you just simply size it that as big as you have for an investment at that time. So some of those things. I'm not going to harp on the electric code in detail, other than to say it's really important to follow the electric code. But there's two pieces of the electric code that I see driving design, as well as driving some maybe is not followed as well. So the first one is the PV rapid shutdown. And so in this case, PV rapid shutdown basically says that when the grid goes down, the DC circuits that are more than 10 feet or more than 10 feet or 1 foot to the inverter, 10 foot in the 2014 electric code, 1 foot in the 17 electric code. That's the difference between the two codes. So we're currently in Nebraska on the 17 code. And it would say the DC circuits running more than 1 foot from the inverter has to be lower than 30 volts DC within 30 seconds. So we've got to essentially de-energize any of those circuits essentially up right next to the solar panels. And so this changes how we design this equipment. And so let's touch on those, and then we'll come back to the other one. So in this case, if I've got a string inverter, and let's first imagine that it is up on a roof. This string inverter is up on a roof. I have, during a power outage, so I have two strings going on. I have string 1 and string 2 connected to a string inverter down here. And in the case of that power outage, the string inverter shuts off, but these lines are still energized. And if this is a roof mounted system, that has to be less than 1 foot. Well, I don't tend to want to put my string inverter way up on the roof. I tend to want to put it low to the ground where I can access it. In that case, it does not meet the electric code in and of itself. And so that's why string inverters tend to not be used on roof mounts anymore, because they don't meet the electric code without additional equipment. Additional equipment could be added up here to achieve that, but tends to be add some expense and some things. And so I don't see it happen very much. So let's touch on microinverters now. Microinverters tend to work great because at the time of a power outage, the microinverters are communicating with the grid itself, and they're saying, oh, I don't see the grid. Shut off right up here, right up at the roof level, right at the microinverter. And it meets that electric code in and of itself instantaneously. And it happens within less than a second. It said within 30 seconds. I mean, less than a second. It's down and shut off. And so that works really well. So now let's go one more down and look at string inverters, or a string inverter with optimizers. In this case, I have a string inverter living down here on the ground, but I have optimizers up here. In the case of a power outage, when this shuts off to the AC grid, it sends a signal to the optimizer that says, oh, don't send me any DC electricity anymore. And it shuts off to 1 volt per optimizer. So in this case, I'd be down to, I've had 2 strings to 6 volts. And remember, I had to be below 30 volts. So it meets the electric code in and of itself. And so that works really well for roof mounts or ground mounts. Let's go back to the string inverter one more time. And now let's just imagine that this is a ground mount. In the case this is a ground mount, I'm going to actually mount this inverter under the array. And because it's under the array physically, it counts as within 1 foot. And thus it meets the electric code just fine. And that's why string inverters work well for ground mounted systems. All right. Now let's touch on another piece of the electric code that I see followed, unfortunately, rarely. And that is that requires restricted accessibility of conductors over 30 volts. And so in this case, I've got a solar array with a string inverter, and then I've just got these wires hanging out underneath, all coiled up. Well, if I've got those strung together, that could be as high as 500 or 600 volts. And because it's just there's nothing blocking me from walking up there and touching them, this does not meet the electric code, and is ugly as sin. And so this is just a challenge that we face, that really ground mounted systems need to have this wiring covered up. And there's a couple ways to do that to meet the electric code. Number one, cover them up with some kind of a tray. Number two, cover them up with some kind of a mesh. This is kind of a nice mesh system in the middle that's covering them up. Thus, they're not accessible. And the third, I didn't have a good fence picture of a small system, but put a fence up. So I could have the wires hanging out. They don't mind the weather, but to make them inaccessible, I put them on, in a fence. Now, roof mounts, we just simply tuck the wires up carefully and make sure they don't hang down and touch the roof, but they're inaccessible because they're up on the roof. So we don't have to worry about some kind of this racking or things to do that on a roof mount, because it's inaccessible because it's on a roof. So if this is back to choosing an installer. When you're talking to an installer, go see some of their systems and go behind them and look at their attention to detail. Their attention to detail is going to tell you whether they're a good installer or not, because they're going to tell you whether they're willing to spend the time to do it right to meet the code. Now let's talk about the three types of inverters again in a different way. Let's imagine that we have this string inverter. Remember, we have two strings of solar panels attached to one big inverter. And then let's imagine we had a tree that was shading, I don't know, right like this. Tree shaded that solar panel. We're going to lose the entire bottom row of that. And if we had a tree that shaded, like this, we lose the entire solar array until the shade was gone. So shade is bad for solar. Now, this is a really, high level academic idea. Shade is bad for solar, but it's extra bad for string inverters solar, because when I have a little bit of shade, I lose everything in line with that string. It's kind of like that flashlight battery where I take the batteries out. I've got four dead batteries, but I only have 3 new ones. So I say, oh, I'll just throw those 3 in, put 1 dead one in. They should work great. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because the weakest link in a series kills the system. In this case, that shaded solar panel kills the whole string. So in a ground mount application, we want to put that in an area with very little shade, if any. Otherwise, we're going to get a lot of loss of production. In the case of a microinverter, I lost my pointer here. Okay, here we go. And I have shade, and I shaded 1 solar panel. I lose 1 solar panel. Not too big a deal. That's because they can bypass. So even if I shaded 1 in the middle, I can bypass that through the microinverters. And so they tend to work much better for partial shade situations. The same is true for string inverters. Because a string inverter, if I shade 1, I only lose 1. I can bypass that issue. Just for fun, let's grab hold back to my solar array at my home. I have a string inverter. And when I look at my production, I can only look at my production as a whole because they're in a string together. Now, if something goes wrong and I get a drop of production because of it, I'm going to notice that probably, and I'm going to know something's wrong, but I don't know which solar panel is the problem because I cannot look at them individually. But when you have one of the other two, microinverters or string inverter with optimizers, that's this system. This is on the roof of the animal science building. I can look at individual solar panels and see how they're doing, either in real time or a day, a week. And you can see here, I've got a problem. I think I have a bad optimizer. It went bad about 2 weeks ago, and I haven't had time to try to get it fixed yet. Again, here's a little bit of O&M that I have to do. I'm helping the university do that, keep track of this system for them. And this one inverter, or this one solar panel with an optimizer, has gone bad possibly, or maybe the solar panel went bad, but it's not causing a problem with all the rest of them because it's just being bypassed through with the rest of them. So that's good news. But that monitoring is much nicer than the string inverter. But again, I still think personally that string inverter is low cost, is why I did the string inverter. Let's move on. Let's talk about production. When we talk about production, what I'm talking about is how do we estimate how much it's going to generate in a year, depending on where I put it, what tilt angle I put it at, and then finally what direction I face it. So I ran a model, and this is based in Lincoln, but really no matter where we are, it's going to have a pretty similar, it's going to be pretty similar, just a slightly different tilt angle. But what I did is I did every direction. I faced a system north, I faced a system south, I faced a system west, east, every direction. I did every tilt angle from essentially flat to 90 degrees. And then I took the highest number and I made it 100%, and everything else is a percentage based on that. And I want to point out that essentially my 100% is right there. In Nebraska, it needs to be faced due south to get maximum production at a tilt angle of basically 34 to 44 degrees. That's where I'm going to get maximum production. Now, let's just say I have a roof and I want to put the solar on my roof, and it's a 412 pitch roof, which is really common. Really, you do not want to change the pitch angle of the solar because it's going to cost, it's going to look ugly. And what's going to happen? I'm going to lose about 5%. There's my 412 pitch roof. So I think really the idea is just understand what you're losing and calculate your system based on that versus on the maximum, and understand that. Now, if you say, well, I only have an east facing roof, well, and it's 412 pitch, I'm losing right at about 20%. Actually, it's actually right here. But anyway, that's a 20% loss for an east facing roof. Now, is that a deal breaker? Maybe, maybe not, that 20% loss, but I need to calculate that my production is going to be 20% of what it was if it was optimal, and see, is it making enough electricity to justify the expense? The same way when I face it west, I'm losing right at about 20%. So just important considerations. We need to estimate what it's going to lose, or what the production is, so that we can figure out, again, how much yield do I have? Is this kind of like corn yield? How much yield can I expect out of that location? And this is how we're doing it. And there's some different models to help you be able to do just what I did. I will mention that, although due south is really important, the same thing is true where if it's just a little bit off, you're probably okay, but you don't, you don't want to go too far off before you lose about, before you start losing pretty significantly. And so this is where, if I'm southwest, southeast, it's okay, but if you go all the way to east, you're losing quite a bit. Here's another way to look at it. This is just altering the tilt angle and not the azimuth. So these are all facing due south, where again, in Nebraska, that 38 degrees is where optimum, but it's not, but somewhere between, that 25 and 45, it's pretty flat before it starts falling off. But really, I bring this slide in for these two on the right. This is one axis tracking and two axis tracking. So one axis tracking, it pivots on a pivot point, and it faces east in the morning, and it follows the sun across the sky and faces west in the evening, and resets itself to do it all again every day. That's one axis tracking, gaining about 15 to 20% production for one axis tracking. Now, that's cool, but now you have a moving part that breaks down. And if we even look at this picture, look, this one here is not faced the right direction. It's a piece of that's broken down. They got to go out and fix it. This works really well for large scale systems, but I don't like it very well for distributed systems, because I want the most robust, no moving parts I can get, and I don't want to have to fix the moving parts. And so in this case, I don't tend to like it, even though it does produce about 15 to 20% more. It does that by capturing the shoulders. Essentially, you can think about that one axis tracker, because it faces east in the morning, it gets this kind of shoulder morning time better and the shoulder evening time better than a fixed mount system. Two axis tracking, it's actually going to gain production at closer to maybe 30 or 40%, almost 40% more over a stationary array. But now I've got a ton of moving parts. I say a ton. I've got a more complex moving part, because now it's just going to face the sun wherever it is. In the summer, it's going to face more straight up. In the winter, it's going to face more to the south. And it's going to, what it has a lot of times is a little device that looks at the sun and that can adjust the angle of it. These break down much more often because they're more complex moving parts, but they do get quite a bit more production. They do cost a lot more. I actually saw a quote for a large scale, I say a fairly large scale, more of a farm one the other day, and it came in at 80% higher than the fixed mount system. So the cost was 80% more, pretty significant cost increase. Let's go ahead and this is the PV watts calculator. Let's go to the website and look at that for a second. I'm just going to go to a website. I'm going to type in PV watts, and it's going to come up, and it's going to say enter a location. So let's just say I'm just going to put in Beatrice, Nebraska as just a place. You don't have to search your address. You could just search your town. That's going to get you close enough. But you need to search your town because it's pulling a weather file from that location. And you want the weather file that's within about 10 miles of you to get a good quality weather file pulled. So search the town you're in, and then you're going to go and tell it how big the system is. Now, you may know how big a system because you may have got a quote or something like that. But if you don't know, you could just leave it at 4 kW. You could tell it, I tend to tell it, leave it at standard. You can tell it if it's a roof mount or an open rack. Okay, so let's say it's a roof mount. I'm going to leave the system losses as they are. I'm going to tell it, and now I can tell it, do I have a south facing roof or not? 180 is south, 270 is west, 90 is east, 0 is north, and then the tilt angle of the roof. 412 pitch is very close to 20, so I'll leave it at 20. And let's see what it produces in Beatrice. It's estimating 5,755 kilowatt hours per year. That's a very good estimate based on a good weather file. How much does it rain? How many cloudy days are there? So that's a good estimate. But you could say, well, I have a house that generates 9,000 kilowatt hours a year, that uses 9,000 kilowatt hours a year. I'd like to figure out how big of a system would it take to generate 9,000. Then you can just come back and start altering this size. Let's say it's 8 kW. Oh, now I'm at 11,000, a little too big. Let's say 7 kW. And you can just play with that a little bit to see some sizes of about what you want it to be. So that's maybe 6.5 kW would have been the right answer. The other thing that's fun, it's not real perfect, but it can be fun, is you click on this draw your system, and it's going to zoom in to or it's going to create a aerial photo of your city because or near your location. And so then let's just say we're going to come in, let's say to this house. I don't even know who lives here, but this is the house we're going to try it at here. And we're going to say, what if we put a solar in that was, oh, I don't know, here to here to here to here. How big is that? How big a solar could I put there? And you draw it, it says that could be 4.8 kW. So it's just a way to estimate about what size of kW you could put on a particular location. So that's kind of fun to play with a little bit. This is a product from the National Renewable Energy Lab and is quite good. Now, it is very good actually for this production estimate. If you go into the economics, it's pretty rudimentary in the economics. And so it's not great from an economic analysis standpoint, but it is very good from a production standpoint. And so when you get a quote, you should go over to this website, type in how big a system they want to install and see if their number matches this. It should be close. It definitely should be close. All right, let's finish up by talking about picking an installer. So you really want a quality installation. You want to install this solar array and have it be up for 30 years without being touched. That's ideal. It may not be, that might not be guaranteed to happen, but it's ideal. To do that, we need to have good quality installation. We do not want poor quality installation. And so what you want to do is go talk to that installer and say, can I see other systems you've installed? You wouldn't buy a home from a home builder probably if you hadn't seen their homes, or I hope you wouldn't. Go see what they build. Go see how their attention to detail is. This is just an example of a poor installation where, you can look at these kind of stair step, these solar modules. There's different gaps, different places. It's kind of ugly, but also these little mounting brackets that are here. This is a huge gap on the end of that solar. That does, you might not know it, but that doesn't even meet the installation guidelines for the solar panel. That the wind and snow loading is not going to be good for that. That's a real problem. This one's too close to the edge. That one's too close to the middle. But even then, you can recognize, even if you don't know the installation guidelines, you know that that's ugly, right? And so you can go and look at these and decide what you think. But it really is important to have a good quality installation, straight lines, wires all tucked up nice, covered if they have to be, things like that. When you get a quote from an installer, it should have all of these things. A clear list of all of the make and model of all equipment. If your quote doesn't have that, you need to ask for it immediately. This is not acceptable that they do not give you the make and model of all the major equipment. That's the solar panel, the inverter, and the racking predominantly, those three things. Clearly mark the total price, not just the net price. They're telling you, this is what you have to write the check for. You want an energy production estimate that you can go and look at. And if you have shade, this PV watts estimate assumes no shade. That website I just showed you assumes no shade at all. And so it's really important that if you have shade, that they took that into account. So really critical in that way. So you want a production estimate. Now, they don't have to do an economic analysis, but if they do, it should be at least halfway decent, meaning they should not have false or bad things like a really high inflation factor, saying, well, didn't you know all your electricity is worth one price? Your rate schedule almost guaranteed has multiple prices, winter and summer. But also remember that net excess generation, net excess generation, all electricity is not worth the same price all year. And so we need to have it based on a real rate schedule. and we have to calculate using the correct incentives. And I say correct incentives. I'm going to tell you one thing. I saw a quote once from an installer that added a rebate of, I don't know, $4,000. Well, that rebate didn't exist. That rebate wasn't a incentive that they got from somewhere. That was simply their own company raising the price of the system and then taking off $4,000 to make it look good. It didn't exist. That's not good business, in my opinion. You don't want to work with a company that does stuff like that. So the correct calculation of incentives. They're telling you what incentives you actually have and not adding fake ones. All right. I'm going to talk about some of the things I would do to picking an installer, and then I'm going to talk about some of the things the utilities in Nebraska are doing. So you want to ask them lots of questions and get in good conversations. Questions like, how many systems have you installed? Where are they? How many years have you been installing? Have you worked with my utility? Can I see one? I know that it's kind of sometimes nerve-wracking to go out and call their references and go see those, but do it. Go see their systems. Look for the quality of installation that you want. What is the estimated production of my system at my location? Again, I've given you a way to calculate that. Some utilities have a solar calculator, but compare that. Make sure it's in the ballpark. Make sure that if you have shade, that they're taking that into account. And the way to do that is, if you have some shade and their number is the same as PV watts, they're not taking shade into account. Their number should be lower if you've got some shade, even partial shade. If you've got a lot of shade, that's an extra big problem. And maybe you should be putting a system in a different place. Does your system need rapid shutdown? Ask them that question. You don't need to be an expert on the electric code to ask this question. What you're looking for is that they can give you a good, coherent answer to this question, because that means they're well read on the electric code and they understand it. If you're talking to just a salesman, doesn't matter. They need to be a good, coherent answer to this question. This is an important concept. It's important to sales as well, because they shouldn't be trying to sell you something that doesn't meet the electric code properly. Ask this question. And just judge by what answer you get. Do you set up internet monitoring? Remember how important internet monitoring is. Internet monitoring is critical so that you can know when your system is up and running properly, when it's broken down, and also because it can initiate the warranty on some inverters. So it's really important. If you have a system that internet monitoring is difficult, I understand. Work through it. Figure out how to get it hooked to the internet temporarily through a cell phone or something like that, so that maybe you could check it periodically twice a year or something like that. But most people, you should be able to get it hooked to the internet through the Wi-Fi in your house, or use a Wi-Fi antenna to extend it farther away. That's what I use. Mine is slightly too far away from my house just for the Wi-Fi. I have a Wi-Fi antenna that just points at my house and kind of sucks my Wi-Fi from the house. Check with your utility for their experience. They may have some opinions on installers and if they've done well with them or not. And you could see what information they can give. Finally, let's talk about some of these trade ally programs. Utilities have begun initiating these trade ally programs. Your utility may, others may not. In Nebraska, Lincoln Electric Systems, Omaha Public Power District, and Nebraska Public Power District have all initiated these trade ally programs because they have seen misleading advertising, unrealistic paybacks, exaggerated production, incentives that don't exist, and then poor installations. And they want to reduce the occurrence of these two things, and they put this trade ally program in as a way to try to do that. Trade ally programs tend to offer training to installers by the utility. The participating installers promise to represent utility information accurately, like the rates and incentives. And when they do that, they then get on a list of kind of trade ally installers for that utility. And then the customers that use participating installers of the Trade Ally program can sometimes access utility-based incentives. And that's where there's that kind of carrot for not only the customer to use them, but for the Trade Ally program for the installer to be part of the Trade Ally program. Now, this isn't necessarily an endorsement from the utility. This also does not guarantee a quality installation, because anybody that's an installer that does the proper steps can be part of the Trade Ally program and then not do a good installation. But what it is it's a hurdle. And I think that when you put this little hurdle in, I think the hope is that poor installers won't want to go through that hurdle. And the good ones will do their due diligence and go through that hurdle. Prospective solar owners still need to do their homework and pick that installer and try to do the best job they can. And just because they're not on the list doesn't mean they're not a good installer. Just because they're on the list doesn't mean they're a good installer. But it is a hurdle. It is a place to look for installers. And even if you're not a member, but you know that utility is in your general area, you could look at their list. So let's just touch on some of these. Lincoln Electric System's goal for their program is to increase the quality of economic analysis and increase the likelihood of quality installations. Their trade allies must attend training and complete an acknowledgement. And they must promise to represent the rate schedules of LES and their incentives accurately. And then customers who use that can gain this value of capacity incentive. And if you don't use a trade ally, you can't get that incentive. So that is a carrot for you to use one of their trade allies if you're a Lincoln Electric Systems customer. This is their website. It's called the Solar Trade Ally Program. You can find it on the LES website. NPPD has very similar goals. I'll let you read those. One difference that they have in NPPDs is a solar checklist where the installer provides the checklist to the customer. And it's basically a checklist of kind of important information that the customer should know. They must also use the correct rate schedule for calculations and display the inflation rate for electrical use calculations if they do economic analysis. So they have to display that inflation rate. So very similar programs, just slightly different. This is their website. They have a video that's meant for the installers, but you're welcome to watch it even if you're not an installer. OPPDs is, again, kind of similar. I'll let you read through their goals, but again, attend training and then complete an acknowledgement to be part of their Trade Ally program. They are looking towards doing a rebate incentive, but they haven't got that completed yet as of 2023 early in the year, but we'll look forward to that happening as we move forward. One interesting thing about OPPD's Trade Ally program is that they do it not only for solar, but for HVAC customers, so air conditioning and heating and lighting. So, or I say customers, so they're installers. So different companies in the Omaha area you can have trade allies. So if you're looking for an HVAC installer, you could look at their trade ally program. If you're looking for some lighting installation changes, you can look at their trade ally program. So we're seeing them adopt that for more industries than just solar. So that's interesting. If you're interested in a very detailed look at what we talked about today in more like 25 pages of reading, here is, you can find this at my website. This is a publication that I've written. There's also videos that could go along with this that are about 4 to 6 hours in length. And so you can go through an economic analysis if you're interested in doing that. I go through a National Renewable Energy Lab model called the System Advisor model. So this presentation, among others, will be on this website, bioenergy.unl.edu. If you have individual questions, I would invite you to send me an email, give me a phone call, leave me a message. If I didn't I wasn't here, and we can talk about your individual situation. And in some cases, I can help you run through an economic analysis for your unique situation. Thank you for joining. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.